I would just like to go ahead and get us started this afternoon with our quick introductory PowerPoint before we go ahead and introduce Baker for his talk this afternoon on Gardens in the Stand, Historic Early Landscapes in the Southwest. I would like to just get us started with our land acknowledgements. The Chaco Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits. Our mission-related work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. We respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Chaco Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Our mission is to empower the present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. To learn more about our mission and the different work that we do, you can visit us online at www.crowcanyon.org. And I just want to take a moment to thank you all for your continued support of our mission, whether you tune into our webinars or travel with us on our in-person programs. We couldn't do it without you. We really appreciate you guys making the past 40 years of our mission a success, and we just want to thank you as we look towards the future as well. So thank you so much for your attendance today and on all of our other programs as well. If you have any issues on Zoom today, we encourage you to head over to our Facebook page where this is being live streamed, and you can find that at crowcanyon.org/Facebook. We do ask that you put all of your questions into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. When you add the questions to the chat, they do run the likelihood of getting buried, so please try to keep your questions in that one area. And then if you have any issues and if you want to watch this later, we do encourage you to subscribe to us on YouTube where we post most of our past webinars. We have a couple of really great upcoming talks. Next week, we have Duck Pots in Brooklyn, Rediscovering the Hunters Point Chaco Community with Dr. Kelly Hayes Gilpin, and that'll be next Thursday, August 24th. The following week, we have a sponsored talk with Four Corners Lecture Series in Canyons of the Ancients National Monument called Seeking My Center Place, Migrations Through Science and Tradition with Lyle Belinqua. And that'll be Thursday, August 31st. Without further ado, I want to just take a moment to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Baker Morrow. He has been a principal of Morrow, Reardon, Wilkinson, Miller Limited landscape architects for the past 43 years. He and his office have won over 140 awards and citations for design and service since 1980. Mr. Morrow is a professor of practice of landscape architecture at the University of New Mexico and the founder of the Master of Landscape Architecture MLA program at the university. A third-generation New Mexican, he is the author of Best Plans for New Mexico Gardens and Landscapes and a Dictionary of Landscape Architecture, as well as the co-editor of Canyon Gardens, the Ancient Pueblo Landscapes of the American Southwest. Without further ado, I will go ahead and pass the microphone over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the Chaco Canyon Archaeological Center, and thank you, Taylor, and Dr. Liz Perry, the director, for asking me to chat this afternoon for a few minutes about one of my favorite subjects, and that is the title of this particular lecture, Gardens in the Sand, Historic Landscapes in the Southwest. And since 1980, I've been the director of the Registry of Historic Landscapes in New Mexico, and I've been looking at historic landscapes of all kinds: old plazas, old courtyards, old parks, gardens, and other forms of landscape architecture all around the state, and not just quite ancient ones, such as the ones we find in the Four Corners, but more recent landscapes constructed by the Spaniards after they began to filter into the Southwest and show up after 1540, landscapes during the Mexican period after 1820, various landscapes and gardens of the territorial period in New Mexico from about 1821 to 1846, from about 1846 to about 1912, and then early statehood landscapes in New Mexico from 1912 until around 1970. Now, one thing about historic landscapes is that they contribute to the cultural history of their times. And old landscapes consist of two different very strong forms or elements of the softscape, the plant materials that you find in them, and also the hardscape, the pavement materials, the walls, the benches and seating, other forms of and features of landscapes that you'll find all around New Mexico and elsewhere in the Southwest. And when we look at the most ancient of gardens and landscapes in the Southwest, what we typically find is that in a place like New Mexico, it is absolutely loaded with old landscapes. And it's a pleasure to go into the countryside and go into early New Mexican settlements and look at the contributions of the old landscapes to settlement development here in the Southwest. The early Puebloan people were not just skilled gardeners, but they developed their landscapes in patterns as often as not. So just as when they built the structures that we usually think of as pueblos, and the buildings in those pueblos, as they built one settlement after another, they didn't reinvent the forms they were using for their buildings. We've discovered over the last 30 or 40 years, since about 1980, that these patterns in the landscape show up as well. And here in New Mexico, the pueblos of the Four Corners in the Chacoan area are the earliest, but the Mimbres Gardens in the southwestern part of the state, in the Mimbres Valley and nearby, are equally old, and many of those gardens and landscapes are 1,000 or 1,100 years old. So I've worked on these, on identifying features and characteristics of these ancient landscapes for about 45 years now, identifying where they are. Many of the features of the New Mexican pueblos and the southwestern Colorado pueblos are found in the settlements in the region, but also in outlying settlements such as Wupatki, for instance, in Arizona. So when we're looking at these old landscapes, we've discovered here in New Mexico that there are about 5 distinct landscape districts or Pueblo districts that have developed over the last 1,000 years, a series of patterns and landscape forms. And the striking thing that always emerges from these kinds of studies is how many settlements there are and how many characteristics of the landscapes we can actually look at. So that's just the briefest of introductions, but let's take a look at some of these features and characteristics and where they occur.
Your slides are coming through clear.
Are they out? Okay, thank you. We always think of Chaco Canyon and Pueblo Bonito as one of the most spectacular sites in the Southwest, and we're looking at a view of Pueblo Bonito here. The foreground, of course, is one of the great plazas at Pueblo Bonito. And an interesting thing about these courtyards or large plaza areas at Pueblo Bonito is that they are divided in two. But when there are two actually pretty large open plazas, which are very characteristic of southwestern landscapes. But when we look from an aerial point of view or an isometric point of view, here's an interpretation by the Park Service of what Pueblo Bonito itself looked like. We find a couple of very unusual landscape forms in front of the the Pueblo Bonito building structure itself, you'll see the platform mounds off to the outside of the front wall. And many archaeologists think that those are derived from Mesoamerican forms. But when we go across the wall and into the plaza itself, right in the middle of the plaza form, there's something very unusual going on. You'll notice that the Pueblo Bonito layout is a half circle or a half radial Pueblo form. This is completely unique to the people of Chaco. Nowhere else in the world do you find such a common feature as a plaza or a public square in a half radial form, such as this, a half circular form. It's unique to the Chacoan people, and it's a unique urban form. And right in the middle of the lower part of the photograph along the front wall, we also find something highly unusual and remarkable. In the 1920s, Neil Judd, the archaeologist, excavated this part of the Pueblo Bonito complex and discovered the remains of a very large ponderosa pine that had been cultivated there for centuries. And ponderosas don't occur naturally in Chaco Canyon. They come from the Chucay Mountains or the Chuscas or the distant Jemez Range. Here are ponderosa pines in a modern context. This is the University of New Mexico campus. And yet, in the case of Pueblo Bonito, a very large ponderosa was cultivated and grown for quite some time. It seems to have been a time marker. And as an ornamental landscape feature, it's the oldest ornamental landscape feature in the Southwest and the oldest ornamental planting that we know of. Now, when we go just a short distance away from Chaco's Pueblo Bonito complex, what we run into is Chokecherry, another very large building complex. And here we are in the middle of Chokecherry, which also has this half radial or half circle plaza form. And what we're looking at, of course, is a courtyard that's surrounded by an outside wall. So from some of the very earliest times here in the Southwest, approximately 1100 years ago or so, what we find are the beginnings of city walls around, or very distinct layout walls around the important buildings of Chaco society in the central part of Chaco Canyon. Now, what you'll find around New Mexico is that there's an enormous number of small-scale Pueblo settlements north of I-40, the old Route 66. By some counts from the Laboratory of Anthropology in Santa Fe, 3 to 4 sites per acre from I-40 up to the Colorado border. So there are settlements everywhere. And the period of ancient Pueblo or ancestral Puebloan building went on for many, many centuries. Here is a site in central New Mexico in the Manzano Range, south of Albuquerque. It's the old Salinas Pueblo mission site of Quarai. And within Salinas Pueblo missions, there's another very large Pueblo complex at Las Humanas. Here we are at the top of the hill on which Las Humanas is sited. We're looking across the valley, and if you look at the streaks in the ridge line in the far distance and sort of the sandy valley that lies between Gran Quivira, Las Humanas Pueblo, and that distant streak in the Pinon Juniper woodland, what you're actually looking at is Pueblo Pardo. It's another twin town that was extant at the time that Las Humanas was a very active town in central New Mexico. And the entire valley that we're looking at here is like an open space, and a planted open space with a number of small-scale gardens that were used by the people of Pueblo Pardo and the people of Las Humanas to earn a living, to actually supply food for the towns. Now, as often as not, an ancient landscape is not covered in New Mexico or not sheltered in New Mexico by large shade trees. They're more often a happenstance, such as this ash tree in the Mimbres country of southern New Mexico. More frequently, what we find to be the case is that the early Pueblo people, 1200s, 1300s in central New Mexico, built their towns and their settlements in most unlikely places. This is the archaeologist Mike Marshall, who's very well known for his work at Chaco, but Mike is also quite good at finding ancient routes and trails from one Pueblo site to another. And we're standing at a Pueblo in the middle of the Chupadera Mesa region, south of the Manzanos. This is what the view looks like. But what I'd like everyone to maybe take a look at is excuse me a moment, is the shade of the soil in the foreground, which is rather dark. This is a downhill slope at the Pueblo in question in the Chupadera Mesa area, usually planted in small pocket gardens, tiny gardens, and in the most unlikely of places with less than 10 inches of rain a year. And yet in town after town of old Pueblo settlements, we find that tiny gardens like this one are pretty common. This is a little hollow garden. It's often found in the Salinas country and in the Tewa country of the North Jemez Range in New Mexico. And it's a garden that's saucer shaped. It's depressed in the middle, and usually corn, beans, and squash, amaranth, tobacco quite frequently, and cotton are very frequently grown in small gardens of this kind. Well, you might wonder how the Pueblos could possibly supply enough food for themselves in gardens of that size, which can be as small as 6 by 8, but are more commonly something like 8 by 12 in size. And when you have a village of, say, 400 to 500 inhabitants, many of my archaeologist friends have told me, well, it seems to be the case that you would need something like 2 to 3 acres of gardens per inhabitant to successfully supply a village. So let's say you've got a small settlement of 400 people. The gardens around the village could be 3 times 400, 1,200 acres, and they're scattered through the woodlands, the pinon juniper woodlands, around many of these central New Mexican towns. So how did the Pueblos supply themselves, build their gardens, and plant them in everything that they did plant them in, and earn a living from it or feed themselves? Well, they had collections of gardens. So we typically think of them as farmers, and as Pueblo farmers, they of course were very successful, but a more accurate term would be to describe them as instead of farmers, they're gardeners, and they depended very strongly on collections of gardens. Here at Quarai in the Salinas Missions area, we're looking at a tall planting of giant dropseed grass, and it grows in a particular form in these open spaces, the courtyards in the Salinas country. It's usually rectangular. The rectangles are maybe 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and I was very curious about this and studied it for many years. And what this large dropseed grass is reflecting is the additional nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that are contained in the soil beneath a collapsed ramada or structure. And where the wood fell down and hit the ground in a rectangular form, formerly it was a shade structure. As it decomposed, it became a source of nutrition for upcoming grasses. So you might find shorter grasses such as blue grama, buffalo grass, and then ricegrass off to the side, but where a ramada has collapsed, you'll find something like giant dropseed. So in many cases, when we're looking at these old landscapes that are 600 or 700 years old or older, the plants themselves provide lots of clues about what people grew and the purposes for which the gardens were created in many settlements, ancient settlements around the Southwest. In far southwestern New Mexico, we find that the Mimbres people were very fond of growing agaves in their gardens. And the agave looks like a yucca, produces a tremendous seed stock, but it's a very good food plant. And oftentimes the agaves have lasted where Mimbres or Mimbres Magallon people planted them, and they are a good marker that you can use to locate ancient gardens. Over in Arizona, as I mentioned, at Wupatki Monument, there are a couple of other landscape features that are part of this extraordinary collection of early landscapes from 700 or 800 years ago. Wupatki is a collection of small-scale buildings very near Flagstaff, Arizona, in a small pueblo, and many of the buildings are built as they are in southwestern Colorado on top of large boulders. But in this particular instance at Wupatki, there's a blowhole where a very strong gust of wind comes directly up out of the ground as part of a cave system that has picked up dropping air coming out of the atmosphere, cooled it in the ground, and up it comes. And it was a shrine of sorts for the Wupatki people, but directly behind it is this extraordinary ball court, and it's the biggest one in the Southwest. It's obviously a Mesoamerican landscape feature. We do have ball courts like this, but not quite as large in far southwestern New Mexico in the Boot Heel area. But this is the most illustrative of an extraordinary landscape feature that we can add to our collection of features and characteristics of the landscape architecture of our part of the Southwest. Here's a view of the ball court in use. And what kinds of plants were the Pueblos concerned with in their gardens? We constantly hear in Southwestern archaeology and Southwestern history about corn being cultivated, squash, beans of various sorts, as I mentioned earlier, amaranths. But when we take a closer look at an extraordinary place like Quarai, the Quarai unit within Salinas Pueblo Missions National Monument in central New Mexico, we find people cultivating chokecherries and cultivating them pretty extensively. And the garden collections in this beautiful valley at the south end of the Manzano Mountains are based on a series of springs spread out over a valley that were able to support a number of shrub, berry, and fruit producing individual plants. So the chokecherry is just one plant among many used by the ancient inhabitants of Quarai. If we go 10 miles away, another beautiful site and very interesting site within Salinas Missions National Monument is Abo, the Pueblo of Abo. And we often find lots of pictographs or petroglyphs alongside many of the gardens that are present at Abo and present at Quarai. And this is just a sampling of a bit of rock art there. But it's not just petroglyphs that occur as extraordinary landscape features in the Salinas country. We also have shrines, various kinds of shrines, and they often look like this. They are pecked into rock and frequently found, in my experience over the last 20 or 30 years, at the south end of villages, and usually close to a water source, such as the one that you see in the the middle part of this photograph. And we even have a description from a very puzzled Spaniard in this 17th century history of New Mexico, Harvest of Reluctant Souls. We have a description of these shrines, and the Spaniards didn't know what to make of them. But careful study shows that they're fairly common, usually at the south end of town, of towns of various kinds, and almost always near a water source. Now, the Pueblos are sophisticated gardeners. They know a lot about their region. And when they develop these pocket gardens that I've been mentioning, they create them in the bottom part of a valley, on the north slope of a hill, on the top or the ridge of a hill, so to speak, and on the north-facing slope. So they build these gardens everywhere. And modern gardeners typically would look at the kinds of soil that the Pueblos were dealing with, and the rocky and stony and alkaline condition of the soil, and just shake their heads and say, well, how in the world could you build a garden system there? Well, not only were the garden systems extensive, and we can still find their remains because it's so dry here in the Southwest, it's just a matter of close observation to find them. Not only did they build those gardens, they very often built water systems that worked for them too. And we find these in southwestern Colorado and southeastern Utah. There will be, if you look at the top of this sketch, a sandstone outcrop up one side of a canyon with swale flowing into it. The Pueblos would dam up the swale to create a small pond, and many of the most technically advanced Puebloan people building their settlements found that the water that was dammed on top of the rock would filter down through the porous sandstone and actually form pools at the bottom of a large boulder. So is this a kind of sophisticated waterworks? Yeah, it certainly is. It begins as a pool, ends as a pool, but it's an extraordinarily interesting way and efficient way to keep a village in water many centuries ago. Now, I mentioned the Pueblo of Abo in the Salinas country and the Pueblo of Coray. What I've noticed over the years is, of course, the people at Coray were Tiwa-speaking people. Tiwa is a living language today. It's spoken in the Pueblo of Isleta and in Taos and Picoris in New Mexico in the Rio Grande Valley. And the people of Coray were Tiwa speaking, but the people of Abo, who were 10, 15 miles off to the southwest, were Tompiro speaking people. And they had several towns of pretty considerable size in the southern Manzanos. And they also built these small pocket gardens that I've been talking about, but they're much more chatty on the rocks than the Tiwa-speaking people are. You'll often find a Tompiro small-scale garden, pocket garden, and if you look next to it, you can often find that the gardeners have been up in the rocks after they've been doing their hoeing and planting, and they're painting pictures of what their lives looked like. And this is some of the rock art that we find at Abo, but it doesn't occur so much at Coray. What were these early Puebloan people discovering as they went along for an extended period of time building their gardens around the Southwest, usually in the foothills of a mountain range somewhere? Well, one thing they discovered that is kind of jaw-dropping is that you can use large boulders as irrigation sources. When snow or rainwater hits the top of a boulder, it of course goes down the sides and it goes down under the boulder itself where it's trapped. So the soil stays very moist. And if you look at where larger scale trees and shrubs often grow in the Southwest and foothills, what you'll find is that excuse me, both wild plants and domestic plants grow very well next to these boulders. And that's because, as you see in this illustration, which is a section or an elevation, they're extending their root systems down into the moist soil that's right under the boulders. So the Puebloan gardeners, as often as not around New Mexico, 1,000 years ago, up to maybe 500 years ago, created their small pocket gardens next to boulders, or they rearranged boulders and stones on the surface to capture water and hold it in the soil. And this was especially useful when we experienced in the Southwest, as we are right now in central New Mexico, droughts. Among the plants they used are an extraordinary number of Indian ricegrass plants, side oats grama, and other local grasses. They harvested the seeds and ground them up and used them as food sources for quite a long time. And they continued to use them as they began to develop over a period of 2,000 or 3,000 years, the small scale gardens with corn and beans and squash in them. Now, the system of shrines that we typically find in central New Mexico around Puebloan villages can be about as spectacular as anything that you'll find elsewhere in the Southwest. Here is a circular shrine at the south end of Tenebo Pueblo, and the plaza that's oriented around it, not surprisingly at all, is oriented north-south. So the Pueblo has oriented its plaza feature here according to the cardinal directions. And what we're looking at directly to the north off the plaza is Manzano Peak, which of course is very important to the Pueblo people as part of their cosmology and their local series of rites. So we typically find that shrines in Pueblo villages are very important historic landscape features. Paul Logsdon took this wonderful photograph several years ago, which illustrates what I've been talking about for the last few minutes. You'll see a series of grid gardens on the top of a hill in the center of the photograph, but look off to both sides of the hill in the foreground. You'll see some creases in the earth going down the slopes of the hill itself, and those, of course, are terraces. So the Pueblos were extremely adept at creating this collection of gardens and garden terraces, which they used to feed themselves in their villages. Further north, at the north end of the Southwest, in southern Colorado, if we go to Mesa Verde, the Mesa Verde people even constructed dams, such as Mummy Lake, that we're looking at here at Mesa Verde, and used those to help irrigate their landscape systems and small gardens. So the list of features is very impressive from a series of centuries of early Puebloan gardens, and it also includes enclosures. The Pueblos were the first in the Southwest, the first people to build jacal or upright pole fences here at the town of Abo in the south end of the Manzano Range. What we're looking at with these upright bits of flat plates of sandstone are the foundation footings of jacal fences that at one time surrounded the small gardens at the edge of a period of building at Abo dating from about the 12th century. One of the great Pueblo favorites in terms of garden plants was prickly pear, and the Pueblos grew prickly pear right and left. They knew how to eat it and use it as a food source. The fruits taste a lot like pomegranates, and of course, when you burn the spines off, you can eat the pads themselves, and they're a pretty good vegetable. Even though I had a student once who said, yeah, I chopped some up after your last lecture on prickly pear and put them in with my scrambled eggs, and they tasted a bit like wet cardboard. But I thought they were a little better than that, actually. Other plants that are typically used at a place like Quarai in the Manzano Range, or up in the Tewa country in the Jemez Range, wolfberry. Algerita. This is a wild plant that produces a huge number of berries, part of the collection at Quarai. Here we see the Spanish Mission Church dating from the 1620s at Quarai in the background at the Pueblo, and we have blooming currants in the foreground. And here, introduced by the Spaniards, also in the 1620s, we have tomatillo from Mexico that is still propagating itself after all these centuries in side gardens at that particular site. What did the Pueblos use as garden tools? They often had flat-faced hoes or shovels that they hafted. They put handles on them. And at the Pueblo of Quarai, this is what you typically find as garden implements in the small-scale garden. These shovels or hoes off to the left, and then digging stick points, which are trifaces. And this is what they look like in sight. And in a place like Quarai, as in many of these other small gardens around New Mexico and the pinon juniper woodlands, you'll typically find these kinds of tools right next to the pocket gardens themselves. So here's a sketch of a small pocket garden at Quarai. At Quarai, the typical food-bearing plants, the corn, beans, or squash are found in the middle of a hollow, but on one side or another side, sometimes all the way around, we have shrub-producing plants and berry-producing plants. So here's an actual small garden at Quarai. It's a horseshoe shape. It's taking advantage of a little runoff coming down the hill. This is what it looks like today, but you can figure out what actually grew in these gardens by looking at the pollen grains that still remain there. This is palynology. And here's what this small garden probably had in it. Corn, beans, and squash in the middle. Another Pueblo favorite, the wide-bladed yucca in the background, tobacco plants, cotton growing very commonly, and then currants and sand plums also growing off to one side of the garden. So when you visit Quarai in the spring and there's been enough rain or snow in the winter, you'll just be met with a profusion of blooms. And I was just down there again this past Saturday, and the berry plants all still had loads and loads and loads of berries and fruits. I was working with a group of people showing them what the old landscapes looked like, but we found an enormous pile of fresh bear droppings just as we were going down a small path. So we had to cut our trip short and go back toward the visitors center. It's still a place that's very popular with bears as well as people. Some of the oldest landscape features in the Southwest are found at the living Pueblo of Acoma, the Sky City. And I'd like to close this brief lecture this afternoon with this just amazing shot of a cistern on the top of the rock at Acoma. The water there is rain runoff, but it's mostly water that results from enormous snowballs that the children, the kids of the village, roll up in winter, and they push them into the cisterns and the water melts. And that technique has been used at Acoma for about 1,000 years. So thank you very much. And I hope this brief introduction has been interesting to you. If you are interested in looking at a little additional information, you might want to take a look at Canyon Gardens, the ancient Pueblo landscapes of the American Southwest, or this new account in the New Mexico Historical Review, which is also Gardens in the Sand, New Mexico's Historic Landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Baker. That was just spectacular. as you were talking throughout, I was thinking about how much the perspective that we bring from our life experience, from our professional experience, to looking at these sites, so influences what we think of as important, right? You're looking at this as someone who is trained to see and to engage in garden construction and architecture on a landscape that has certain constraints to it. And everything that you've been talking about really reveals how important, how innovative, how complicated in some ways and intricate these gardens are. And when you go to school to learn to be an archaeologist, they teach us to look at the questions of importance to the discipline at large, right? The origins of agriculture, production specialization, and we, as we know, and we're starting to ask ourselves as archaeologists these questions too. We think that this is the most important thing to these communities because it's the most important thing in our discipline, the most important thing that we've been trained to look at. But what it seems like you and some of the others in the books that you've cited are really looking at is there's some things that are really meaningful. Maybe not the focus of Western anthropology and archaeology for sure, but the details, right? The skills, the little things that you talked about that really popped out at me. You know, these are the things that grow best if they're next to a boulder, right? Or watered best in these features. And it's really shifts your perspective on the communities. So I guess maybe in the big picture, and I think there's some questions coming in that are similar to this. So I'll just kind of steal that and ask if you might talk a little bit more about, based on what you've read and you've learned in your perspective as a landscape architect, what do you think in society and culture, the level of importance of these gardens vis-a-vis, large corn agriculture, et cetera, were to these communities?
Well, I'll tell you, Liz, in looking at these old gardens for so many years, in such a difficult place to create a landscape and make it last, a designed landscape, I have nothing but admiration for these neighbors of ours across time, these early Puebloan people who were so successful here for so many years in feeding themselves and in developing a genuine Pueblo landscape architecture. It's got its own characteristics, its own traits, its own features that are just repeated in side after side. I just have a very strong appreciation of them as sophisticated people and sophisticated gardeners. So when you look at their settlements, if you look at spectacular buildings like Chaco Canyon, as I pointed out, you're just so awestruck by the buildings themselves. Sometimes you don't pay attention to the open space nearby, but when you're really looking hard or closely at settlement history, what you have to say is that the landscape architecture of a town or a village contributes very strongly to the construction of a settlement. And as a settlement develops, these patterns that we find in Chaco Canyon or in the Galisteo Valley or in the Salinas province, all these landscape characteristics amount to a more complete picture of the settlement history of the Southwest than you would just get from looking at the buildings themselves. So in your neck of the woods, in your part of the Four Corners, there's just this unbelievable wealth of settlements right and left. And over at Sand Canyon, for instance, people talk a lot about courtyard suite developments in the construction of the pueblos. So kind of a kit of parts, a set of buildings, a courtyard, maybe a kiva, or an underground gathering chamber, nearby terraces and small scale gardens. I think the pattern that pops out to me from so long ago was probably established by the Chacoans themselves, and then it just extended itself elsewhere in the Southwest. This idea that you don't go out and plow a field of 40 acres and plant a lot of corn. You build a very small garden that works in one spot, and then you duplicate it. You do lots of different gardens. And people come up to me constantly and say, well, what about the form of the villages themselves? But lots and lots of the settlements that I've looked at, when you look at the plaza and the location of the structures around the plaza, it's completely formal. So the Pueblos, as often as not, build formal landscapes. They build formal settlements oriented to the cardinal directions. So those are some of the things that have fascinated me for years and that I continue to study. And I think I've probably got enough work for about 1,000 graduate students for the next couple of hundred years. But you have to make a start somewhere. So it's one good place to look is at how landscapes complete a settlement along with the buildings.
Oh, no, absolutely. And it strikes me that if we actually walked out to some of these ancestral landscapes today and saw the gardens growing, right, it would have such a different impact on us than when, you know, you basically see the water control features, or you have to actually do the pollen analysis or the botanical analysis to see what was there. But to try to visualize it, I think it would stand out so much more, such a larger part of the community. I want to ask this question from one of our viewers that I think ties into some of what you were saying, and it's a loaded question in that the concept of aesthetics and versus, you know, subsistence. These are maybe artificial, artificial divisions, and also what constitutes an aesthetic is so different cross-culturally. So with all of that, those disclaimers, someone asks, how common is it to find plants cultivated, and they say for landscape, and I'm thinking what they mean is also for, you know, not for subsistence primarily, but or maybe for aesthetic purposes. Are there any defining features between plants cultivated for subsistence versus landscape, like the ponderosa pine in Chaco?
Well, in such a short lecture, I don't really have time to do endless details, but what I would say is that let's take a look at what people grow in gardens and why they grow gardens. Sometimes in a garden or a cultivated setting, you'll find a plant grown for medicine, for its medical purposes. And if you read a book like Bill Dunmire's book on ancient Pueblo people and plants in the Southwest, Bill talks a lot about cultivated plants used by the Pueblos, or collected plants that were medical in nature. They were used to treat problems or illnesses. Well, the Pueblos also planted regularly in their gardens cotton, because they grew cotton, and from the cotton fibers they wove clothing and blankets and mats. Another common purpose for growing plants in a garden is for building materials. And if you look at a garden, if you look at a Pueblo like Quarai, it's unbelievable when you begin to look at the plants, not as necessarily strictly landscape features, but you realize that every plant you're looking at has a use. It has a utility. Single seed juniper, for instance, which typically produces branches 8 or 10 feet long, determines the size of a Pueblo room, because that's the crossed viga length that's used to construct a Pueblo room. And if you look at the gigantic Pueblos, really large Pueblos of the Chama Valley in northern New Mexico, north of the Jemez Range, what you'll find is that the dimensions of the rooms in the Pueblo are also the dimensions of the grid gardens outside the village. So the form of the rooms is reflected in the form of the gardens and vice versa. So building materials, clothing, medicine on top of plants grown for food. These are all very typical reasons that people have in the 21st century of producing agricultural fields that specialize in a certain kind of product, or gardens of sorts within towns. The ancient Pueblo people of the Southwest were no different than we are. They used all different kinds of plants and plant species for multiple purposes. So the last part of the question, of course, is aesthetic use of plants. Nobody in the Southwest, nobody likes to, it's too high. Nobody likes to stand out in the sun all day long without some form of shade. So you either build a ramada, or you situate yourself in the shade of a building, or you plant something like this cottonwood tree that's on the screen right now. I think people can still see it at Acoma. So the cottonwood and the pool beside it are very strong landscape features that we would find in modern landscapes too. The thing about Pueblo landscapes is, the interesting thing about them is twofold. First of all, the Pueblo plant palette, the number of plants that the Pueblos have used for over 1,000 years, is in excess of 250 species. 250 species. That's a lot of plants. And many of them are brought into cultivation, but some are just collected outside the settlements. And yet 250 species is remarkable. If you went to the modern city of Silver City in New Mexico, for instance, and you went around doing a plant count, and I've done this for my book, Plants for New Mexico Gardens. How many different species do you find in Silver City? About 220. And that's a city of 15,000 people, 10,000. So maybe 200, 220. Well, we have Pueblo people in the year 1300, in the year 1200, all over central New Mexico and southwestern Colorado, and they're utilizing on a daily basis 250 different species. And some of those plants are grown for shade, some are grown for medicine, many of them are grown for food, some are grown for clothing. So we're dealing with very sophisticated gardeners here who recognize plants and what plants can do for human societies and for their settlements. And they're manipulating their grown environment, so to speak, for their own purposes. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary thing to see these landscapes.
It's huge. Thank you for that description. That's just spectacular. There's some specific questions that I thought might be fun to put out there, and they're things that occurred to me as well. One of our viewers asks, you mentioned, sorry, there's children playing around me, if that's getting through on the noise, just like in many villages, so bear with me. You mentioned the tomatillos is still growing after centuries, and you know, we see wolfberry, of course, all over sites everywhere. This viewer asks, which of the other plants you mentioned are likely to be direct descendants of these ancient plantings?
Well, it won't be news to any archaeologist who walks around the Southwest out in the countryside that if you're looking at a pretty good selection of four-wing saltbush, for instance, or cane cholla, the saltbush is Atriplex canescens, and the cholla Opuntia imbricata, Cylindropuntia imbricata, you're probably looking at an old ruin, and you can add the wolfberry to that. So if you're looking at those three plants, they really like ruins, and they're shrubs, of course, but they grow a lot in ruins. And they are at a place like Quarai, for instance, which is just the biggest landscape lab I know of, an ancient landscape lab in New Mexico. What you find is another extraordinary thing. Quarai lies in a village that's actually oriented east-west, and it has a small stream that runs right down the middle of the canyon. That's a collection of water from these various springs that I was mentioning. And On the south side of the stream is where you find all the ancient Pueblo gardens, stretching back to maybe 1200 or 1100, even older in that valley. On the north side, which is where the mission church was located, the Spaniards from about 1625 until about 1670 created an ecclesiastical hacienda. So the church ran its own ranching and farming and gardening enterprises, piñon nut collections and salt collections. They ran that as a hacienda operation, and they used the Pueblo as the labor source. And the Pueblo just passed out of existence in 1670. There was an enormous drought. The people left, but in the year 1805, 1806, toward the end of the Spanish colonial period, a group of new settlers came into the South Manzano Range, and they reoccupied the old church. And so all of the landscape constructs on the north side of the creek are European or European influenced. All the remaining landscapes on the south side are actually part of what the Pueblo originally created in the way of shrub hollow gardens. So looking at these plants and plant uses, and some of my favorite plants that show up in other Pueblo settings out and about, you almost have to throw the guidebook out the window when you look at a place like Quarai, which has probably had a shrub, berry, and fruit production enterprise in place for about 5 or 6 centuries. I mean, the cultivated plants are just extraordinary. So on the south side of the creek, you find native plants, but in an enormous concentration, very strongly concentrated. On the north side, you find tomatillos and other remnant European farm plants, including apples. There's an apple orchard there too, and regular fruits. But it's just an extraordinary mix and fun to look at, pleasant to visit when the bears are maybe off somewhere else.
This sort of another sort of short question. Is there any evidence of plants that repel pests? Perhaps not bears as pests, but as I sit outside being devoured by mosquitoes, this feels pretty relevant to me. Is this anything you've run across?
Oh, I wouldn't put anything past these Pueblo gardeners. You can see where they've been cultivating the soil in some of their pocket gardens because it's darker than the surrounding soil. It has more carbon in it, so they have been mixing in juniper needles, for instance, or they've been growing beans, which are legumes, which concentrate nitrogen, perhaps more there, and there's more root development than somewhere else. But in terms of plants that repel various pests, I can only chuckle. I frequently at the old town of Abo, also in Salinas, what I find are field houses next to small pocket gardens, and probably I would think those small pocket gardens grew lots and lots of cultivated plants. And next to the field houses, which is probably where the kids had to stay, you sometimes, I've actually found these, you find little piles of stones that the kids picked up and threw at rabbits or at deer to scare them away from the crops. So some of the most effective anti-pest mechanisms that I've found around gardens are probably these piles of stones that the kids, I suspect, used. When the parents would say, "You stay out there, make sure that that garden keeps growing. Don't let the animals get too much of it."
That's brilliant, actually. I love that. That was not what I was expecting to hear. Thank you so much. Well, we're right at 5 o'clock, and we want to be respectful of your time so that you will come back, and you're definitely invited up to Crow Canyon anytime. We have many gardeners who would love to talk to you. So thank you so much for your excellent presentation. And I think Taylor has put Baker's email in the chat if you want to send him some additional questions. And thank you so much. It's just been a great meeting you.
Thank you. I'll come up for a visit. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. All
Sure.
right. Take care. Have a great evening.
You too. Thank you.